So before working our way a little further into the possible ways in which the critical theory tradition can, well, let me back up a little bit. So we've been thinking about critical theory, but on the other side of this, you're talking about on one hand, sort of like decolonial theories and indigenous philosophies and perspectives. And you talk about the problems. So we've kind of defined what the critical theory tradition is. And you talk about problems of definition when it comes to indigenous and indigenous philosophy or non-Western theoretical perspectives. So how do these difficulties in definition complicate the project of rethinking critical theory in relation to non-Western knowledge traditions? There's also a tension here that we want to talk about a little bit more later between sort of academic knowledge production, like if that's like indigenous philosophy or decolonial theory in the academy, and also non-Western knowledge traditions writ large. I mean, this is sort of some of the problems of definition, right? And sort of how do we talk about what is such a heterogeneous set of complicated systems of knowledge. But you also use Baba's notion of a third space to help sort of orient a conversation between critical theory and decolonial perspectives. So could you talk a little bit about these problems of definition and how they complicate the project that you're engaged in here, and then also this notion of a third space as a way into beginning a conversation between critical theory and non-Western traditions?
Yeah, the problem of definition is both a problem for me and also part of the solution in a way. So one of the things that really, that actually took probably the most time writing this was my caution about to what extent I, as a Western scholar, had a right to move into this territory. And, you know, and there's clearly a long history of appropriation, that Western scholars think they can just go in and visit anywhere they like and take what they like and bring it back. And, you know, so there's been an intellectual colonialism that's been going on for some time. And I felt this tension really greatly. I thought, it's clearly wrong to not engage, but it's clearly wrong to engage in the wrong way. So that sort of informed a lot of my action. And I really looked for advice from Indigenous scholars about forms of engagement that they found helpful. And of course, many of them are outward looking, you know, they're wanting engagement, they're just not wanting appropriation, or for us to say everything's commensurable. So with that dilemma in mind, I think, you know, it was very clear that one has the concept of being Indigenous, as I understand Indigenous scholars, such as Georgina Stewart have used it, is both an encompassing term and a very particular one. You know, so there is a concept of place-based knowledge and culture and philosophy, and there are very many different examples of that. And we shouldn't be looking to say that they all have to be the same in any way. So, but the other thing where I think there's a solution here is one of the reasons I like critical theory and find it so powerful, and particularly Adorno's work, is because he rejects so clearly the idea of clear definitions. And, you know, and so in fact, there's a Western stream here that it has something that resonates, and, you know, and it can go back to Nietzsche and the whole idea that once we have an historical form of human being, you can't define, because it always changes. And so that's obviously influenced Adorno, and then Adorno has his own take on this, that, he refers to something like the color red. You can't actually define red. You can describe it. You can say how it feels. You probably could say what spectrum it is on the light scale, but that actually wouldn't help you to know what red is. And then in the same way, going to a much more important example, he talks about freedom. It's really hard to define what freedom is, but when the Nazis knock on your door at 6 a.m., you know you've lost it. So that idea that what we look for, and it's also in Walter Benjamin's work, you know, the concept of constellations, this idea that we can understand things, but that we destroy them if we try and tie them to strict definitions, I think was a really help, that I had that as part of my Western tradition, I think was a helpful way for me to be able to approach different Indigenous thought. And then the idea of the third space, what I was looking for as I looked through the different literature, is I was trying to find a place, a legitimate way to engage as a Western scholar. Although as a Western scholar, I've got quite a complicated history because I'm Australian, and so I understand colonialism, if you like, in two different directions. You know, sort of, I'm both the colonizer of Indigenous Australians, and I grew up in an era where we looked to Britain and how we wanted to escape, you know, being tied to the mother country. So it's quite complicated, but so I was looking for different ways to legitimize the idea that as a Westerner, I could engage with these ideas, because I can't see a way forward if we don't engage. So I came up with, there were actually three that helped me in different ways. So one was Hopkins, the idea of a decolonial conversation. So it's not just being a tolerant conversation, it's a conversation that foregrounds issues of power and the fact that power has been abused, and that, you know, there are historic injustices that have never been resolved. And I think Barbara's third space is something similar. It's about that recognition of power and injustice, and that has to be at the forefront of any engagement between different traditions, bodies of thought. And then also Denson and Lincoln had this idea of fellow travelers, which I liked very much, because when I set out to do this, I probably went along the wrong path of trying to say, look, there's these things critical theory believes in, and it's really similar to a lot of Indigenous thought. And then I read Tuck and Yang, and I thought, whoa, hold on, I've made a really big mistake there. You know, that claim to commensurability could be quite offensive. So I settled on the idea that, mindful of this idea of a decolonial conversation in a third space, could I say that we're traveling over some similar territory, and that we could, if nothing else, support one another's journey.